I told her I had a ticket. She didn't even look at it. At just 16 years old, Imani West sat quietly in first class until a flight attendant's snap judgment forced her to the back of the plane. No one defended her. No one questioned it. But when Imani picked up her phone and sent one message, the sky itself stopped. FAA agents boarded, engines shut down, and a girl who refused to raise her voice made an entire system answer for its silence. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. "Excuse me, young lady, are you lost?" The words sliced through the serene hum of the first-class cabin like a blade across silk. It wasn't just the volume, louder than necessary, it was the tone. Patronizing, suspicious, measured, as if meant to both humiliate and assert control. Heads turned, a few subtle glances, a few raised brows. Most just pretended not to hear. Imani West looked up slowly. She had been seated quietly in seat 2A, tucked against the window, her hands gently resting on the frayed strap of her faded green backpack. Her hoodie sleeves reached the edges of her palms, and her sneakers, scuffed but clean, were planted firmly on the plush carpet. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't drawing attention, wasn't speaking to anyone. She was just sitting, 16 years old, alone. And already, the storm had come. "No, ma'am," she answered softly. "This is my seat." The flight attendant, whose crisp red scarf and tightly pinned hair broadcasted years of authority, didn't budge. Marlene Keating, chief attendant, head of in-flight operations. She had served in the skies for over 15 years and carried herself with the entitlement of altitude. She glanced down at the girl, her blue eyes narrowing with something too sharp to be simple confusion. "You're in 2A?" she said, skepticism dripping from every syllable. "Yes," Imani nodded, reaching into the front pocket of her hoodie. "My godmother booked it for me." Marlene folded her arms. "Godmother," she echoed. "Of course." Imani didn't flinch, but she felt the sting. The boarding pass came out in a transparent plastic sleeve, neatly preserved. Marlene didn't reach for it. She merely glanced at it, gave it half a second, and then stepped back as if offended. "This is first class, sweetheart." There it was again. That condescension. The kind that wrapped itself in polite professionalism but reeked of prejudice. Around them, the first-class passengers, men in tailored blazers, women draped in silk and diamond studs, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one said a word. Imani's mouth opened slightly, as if she might explain that the ticket had been a gift, that she'd earned it through excellence, that she had topped the National Youth Science Honors Program with a project so impressive it had been requested for university archives, that her godmother, Celeste Vaughn, had hugged her after the ceremony and whispered, "You deserve the world, and you deserve a seat at the front of it." But none of that would matter here. Not in this moment. Not to Marlene Keating, who had already decided she didn't belong. "I'm sorry, but I need you to collect your belongings and move to the back," Marlene announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Imani looked down. Her knuckles had turned white around the backpack strap. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. Any protest, no matter how factual, would be twisted. Her refusal would be labeled as a disturbance. Her calm voice would become aggression. Her skin would write the narrative before her words could. So she stood, silently. The backpack slung over her shoulder felt heavier than usual. She turned slowly, walking past row after row of luxury, past leather briefcases and platinum watches, past the men and women who saw and did nothing. Her footsteps were soft, but the silence she left behind echoed louder than any turbulence. In economy, she found an empty seat near the back. By the window, she sat down, pulled her knees up slightly, and rested her head against the cool glass. Her breath fogged the surface faintly, and for a moment she stared not at the clouds outside but at her own reflection. Young, black, brilliant, but always one assumption away from being erased. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. One message, that's all it took. They made me move. Didn't even check my pass. I'm in the back now. She hit send. And with that, the entire world of 30,000 feet was about to shift. Outside the plane, the runway bathed in a golden morning hue. Birds danced above the control towers. A tug operator wheeled a cart into position. Everything appeared normal. Ordinary. But 1,200 miles away, inside a sleek glass tower in Washington, D.C., Celeste Vaughn's phone buzzed. She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she had stepped out of a high-level FAA safety board briefing and made a single call, one that would reach the captain before the wheels ever left the ground. Back on the plane, the engines hummed. The overhead bins were closed. The last boarding announcement played. Seatbelt signs flickered on. Then a sudden ding. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a temporary hold on departure. Please remain seated while we await further instruction." In the galley, Marlene stiffened. A hold? No weather alerts had been issued. No late passengers, no mechanical issues. She grabbed her tablet to double-check, but her screen blinked red. FAA priority hold. Flight 451, maintain gate position. In seat 2A, now vacant, a faint imprint of Imani's presence remained. An untouched magazine, a headrest barely creased. In the back of the plane, Imani stared at her phone. A new message had arrived. "Stay there. Don't say anything. Let me handle it." The sender, Celeste Vaughn, Director of Aviation Safety, FAA. Imani exhaled softly. Her spine straightened. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, but inside, something settled. She wasn't alone anymore. "Captain, why are we holding the flight?" Marlene Keating's voice was strained, despite the even tone she tried to maintain over the crew line. She pressed her earpiece tighter, standing stiffly near the galley. She'd run thousands of flights. Delays were nothing new, but something about this one, it wasn't weather, it wasn't technical, and it certainly wasn't routine. The answer from the cockpit was quiet, firm. "FAA intervention. We've been ordered to remain at the gate. No movement until further instruction." Marlene's blood turned cold. She stood there, still holding the polished metal edge of the galley counter, eyes darting across the cabin. Nothing looked unusual. Passengers sat with their heads buried in magazines, earbuds in, neck pillows half fastened. But there was a pressure in the air. The kind that came before a downpour. She knew something had gone wrong, and it started at seat 2A. In the rear of the aircraft, Imani West sat motionless. She hadn't spoken a word since moving to economy. The passengers around her barely looked at her, yet something about her still presence made them uneasy. She wasn't crying, wasn't complaining, just sitting, watching. Like a storm waiting for a signal. The message from Celeste had already sunk into her chest like steel rods propping up her spine. "Stay there. Don't say anything. Let me handle it." Imani didn't need to know all the details. She didn't need to hear Celeste's voice to believe the promise. Celeste Vaughn had raised her like a second daughter since her parents passed, loved her, mentored her, taught her how to carry herself like a warrior with quiet hands. Celeste didn't yell. She acted. Inside the cockpit, Captain Anthony Sloan adjusted his headset. His co-pilot glanced over, puzzled. "Technical malfunction?" he asked. "No," Sloan replied. "This is different. FAA flagged us before we even requested taxi clearance. High-level alert. They won't say much." He turned to the screen on his console. A flashing red banner read, "Passenger complaint, protocol violation involving minor. Seat 2A, Director Vaughn initiated review, hold position." Sloan exhaled slowly. He'd been flying commercial jets for over 2 decades. Storm reroutes, emergency landings, bomb threats. But he'd never seen this. "Director Vaughn," he muttered. "Why does that name sound familiar?" The first officer blinked. "That's the Vaughn, FAA Safety Director, Pentagon Liaison, ran the 2021 airspace transparency reforms." Captain Sloan leaned back in his seat, lips thinning into a line. Then this just went from delay to crisis. Marlene checked her own screen again. Still nothing new, no official explanation, no details. Then came the whisper. From one of the junior crew members, Eric Dawson. A quiet, observant man in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a deep love for flying. He leaned toward her and murmured, "Is this about the girl?" Marlene looked up sharply. Eric hesitated, then nodded toward the back of the plane. "I saw her boarding pass. It said seat 2A, first class." Marlene's jaw clenched. "Eric, she must have switched with someone or picked it up by mistake." "She didn't," Eric replied. "I saw her take it from her sleeve. It had her name. I remember it because I helped her stow her bag." Marlene stepped back like the air had become thinner around her. "But look, she didn't look like she..." She stopped herself. Her own words. Didn't look like she what? Didn't look like she belonged? Eric didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than anything. In the back of the cabin, Imani closed her eyes. She wasn't resting. She was listening to the murmurs, to the movement, to the sudden tension behind each cart roll and footstep. It was all shifting. And then she heard it. The familiar voice of Captain Sloan over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed to hold our position at the gate due to an FAA coordination request. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, pause all services until further notice." The words were calm, measured, but every seasoned traveler in that cabin knew FAA coordination wasn't normal. Something had happened. And slowly, word began to trickle through the rows. Some passengers whispered. Others turned around. "That girl. It's about that black girl from seat 2A. Why? What happened?" In the FAA Operations Center in Washington, Celeste Vaughn stood like a monolith. Her voice, as she spoke on the phone with internal investigators, was steel-wrapped velvet. "This is not just about one flight," she said. "It's about an institutional pattern. You will treat it like a protocol breach of the highest order." Her fingers tapped the edge of a thick file marked Imani West 16 Domestic Travel, assigned seat 2A. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When Celeste Vaughn spoke, systems moved. Back on the plane, Marlene tried to maintain her professional expression, but the weight was growing. The flight wasn't moving. The passengers were murmuring. And her mistake, something she had made a dozen times before without question, was unraveling faster than she could cover it. She walked down the aisle. Eyes followed her. She tried to ignore them, until she reached the back cabin. Imani didn't look up. Marlene paused, her throat dry, her palms clammy. "Miss West?" Imani turned slowly. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Marlene offered, her voice strained. "Would you please return to your assigned seat in first class?" Imani's expression didn't shift. Her eyes were unreadable, quiet, calm, but her voice was like a scalpel. "Why didn't you ask anyone else to show their ticket?" She tilted her head. "Why me?" Marlene blinked, froze. Every excuse she'd rehearsed vanished, and the cabin went still. Even those pretending not to watch now held their breath. I didn't mean to," she whispered. Imani stood, lifting her backpack. "You didn't have to." She walked past her without another word. Not angry, not triumphant, just resolute. In the front cabin, whispers had turned into quiet realizations. She had the seat the whole time? They made her leave? Why? Because she looked like a student? No one asked these aloud, but they didn't have to. The shame now hung heavy in the recycled air. When Imani returned to seat 2A, she sat down slowly, backpack at her feet, spine straight, and this time, no one looked away. The next moment came like thunder. The cockpit door opened. Captain Sloan stepped into the aisle. He looked directly at Marlene, then gestured subtly. "Miss Keating, the FAA would like a word with you." She followed him back, eyes wide, steps uncertain. Inside the cockpit, the red light on the intercom was blinking. She was handed a headset. The voice on the other end? Cold, sharp, unmistakable. "This is FAA Senior Agent William Reed, speaking on behalf of Director Vaughn. You're under active review for discriminatory passenger handling. Please confirm if you verified the ticket manually or via system cross-check before displacing passenger West from seat 2A. Marlene stammered. "I didn't verify. I looked at it. I thought." "You thought?" There was a pause. "Did you verify with ground crew?" "No." "Passenger manifest?" "No." The silence that followed was more punishing than any scream. Then came the order. "You will escort Miss West back to seat 2A. You will do so with a public apology, and when this flight lands, you will remain on board for formal FAA debriefing." Marlene removed the headset slowly. She turned, eyes hollow, and stepped back into the cabin. She had commanded the sky for years. But now, for the first time, the sky was answering back. "Do not touch the throttle. We are not moving." Captain Sloan's words were final. He stood next to his co-pilot, headset resting around his neck, eyes fixed on the blinking red light that had not stopped flashing since the FAA's command. In all his years in the sky, he had learned how to handle turbulence. But this was not turbulence. This was reckoning. In the silence that followed, the hum of the engines felt distant, like a memory instead of motion. Back in seat 2A, Imani West sat as still as stone. She didn't recline. She didn't adjust her tray. Her hands rested calmly on her thighs, her chin tilted just slightly downward, eyes steady on the fabric pattern of the seat in front of her. She wasn't hiding, she was holding. Holding the tension, holding the silence, holding a space she had always deserved, but had been forced to reclaim. All around her, passengers fidgeted, eyes darting, minds catching up to the truth now unfolding with the weight of federal gravity. 30,000 feet hadn't even been reached, but already this flight had changed everything. Marlene Keating walked back toward the galley like someone walking toward a closing door. Her perfectly tailored uniform still fit flawlessly, but something had shifted inside it, inside her. A crack in the armor. A doubt in the certainty. She stopped midway down the aisle. There were eyes, so many eyes. Not the usual kind, the admiring glances from new flyers or courteous nods from frequent travelers. These were different. They weren't judging. They were remembering. Remembering the moment she had approached the only black girl in first class and asked, without confirmation, whether she belonged. Remembering how they had said nothing, remembering now what their silence cost. In the back of the plane, Eric Dawson watched it all unfold. He had remained silent earlier. He'd followed procedure like always. But something in him had shifted the moment he heard Marlene say, "Some people, you just know they're not supposed to be there." It had felt wrong then. Now it felt unforgivable. He clenched his jaw and turned to face the forward cabin. No more silence, not again. The whisper began with one man, seat 1D. A graying, clean-shaven executive in a Navy sports jacket. "She was in her rightful seat," he murmured to the woman beside him. "I saw it. She had the ticket. That girl was calm, graceful. We all saw it." The woman, draped in pearls, nodded slowly. And we all said nothing. The whisper moved like a current, row by row. I looked away. I assumed the worst. I told myself it wasn't my place. The weight of complicity began to settle on everyone like heavy fog in a pressurized cabin. The intercom beeped again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Sloan began, his voice lower now, more solemn, "we are awaiting FAA officials who will board this flight for an internal review. Please remain seated and allow them to complete their process without disruption." No one moved. No one dared. Outside, the jet bridge began rolling back into place. The locking mechanism of the front cabin door disengaged with a sharp metallic hiss. The door, once sealed for departure, now reopened. Not for departure, but for investigation. Two figures stepped into the cabin. One, a tall woman with a silver FAA badge pinned to her lapel. The other, a somber man in a gray suit holding a leather folder. No smiles, no pleasantries. Just the quiet authority of truth entering the room. The air inside first class dropped a few degrees. They didn't announce themselves, they didn't need to. Everyone on board knew. This wasn't routine, this was federal. Imani raised her head. She watched the agents walk down the aisle without fear, without expectation. Just clarity. The kind of clarity she had earned over years of having to justify her presence in spaces she already belonged to. The lead agent, Officer Tanya Rhodes, stopped just past the first row and spoke clearly. "Head Flight Attendant Marlene Keating, please step forward." A hush fell like snow. Marlene didn't respond for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, she left the galley. Her shoes no longer made confident clicks. Her posture, once proud, was now caught between protocol and regret. She stepped into the open and stopped just short of Imani's row. And their eyes met. Imani didn't blink. Her gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't even hard. It was clear. Clear enough to reflect back every decision, every unchecked bias, every assumption that had ever made Marlene believe she could decide who deserved to sit where. And Marlene had no words. Officer Rhodes didn't interrupt. She gave them space. The unspoken silence between Imani and Marlene became heavier than any storm cloud the plane might have flown through. Then, finally, Imani spoke, so softly that the agent had to lean in to catch it. "Do you believe me now?" Marlene swallowed hard. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Yes." Imani nodded once, then looked out the window again. That was enough. The agents turned to Marlene. The man in the gray suit, Agent Victor Shaw, stepped forward, holding a document. "You are under review for violation of federal in-flight discrimination protocols," he said. "You will disembark for immediate debriefing. Your continued presence on this aircraft is not authorized pending the outcome of the investigation." He didn't raise his voice. But the verdict was final. Marlene's throat tightened, her hands trembled as she reached for her wing's pin. The one she had worn proudly for 15 years. She didn't unclip it, not yet. Instead, she walked the length of the cabin under a silent, unforgiving gaze, not of passengers looking for vengeance, but of people awakened. As she passed seat 2A one last time, Imani didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. Outside the plane, a black SUV waited near the mobile stairs. No sirens, just flashing amber lights. Quiet authority, absolute consequence. Marlene descended without protest, her silhouette shrinking beneath the aircraft's wing. When she was gone, the silence in the cabin lingered. Then, softly from somewhere near row 3, a man whispered. She made the whole system pause, and all she did was sit in silence. Captain Sloan returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will begin final preparations for departure. This flight will proceed as scheduled. Please ensure your belongings are secure." Passengers glanced toward Imani. Some nodded softly, some blinked back guilt. No one looked away. In seat 2A, Imani sat with her eyes forward, her head high. The backpack rested beneath her feet once again, just as it had when she first boarded. But now, she felt lighter. Not because the weight was gone, but because now everyone else finally felt its presence. And for the first time in her young life, she knew they were listening. "Do you know what just happened on Flight 451? That was the first line of the email marked urgent in the inboxes of every executive at Atlantic Sky Airways. It was followed by a link, a single, unedited clip, just 12 seconds long, filmed by a quiet passenger in seat 1C. It showed a young black girl sitting silently in a first-class seat, a flight attendant standing stiffly beside her, then the unmistakable arrival of 2 FAA agents, and finally the girl walking back to her seat, as the flight attendant was escorted off the plane. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just silence and consequence. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, that video had already gone viral. In seat 2A, Imani West didn't know about the headlines yet. She didn't know Twitter was calling her the quiet force who grounded the sky, or that a national morning show had already requested her for an exclusive. She sat the same way she had before the storm, still, composed, alert. Only now, something had shifted, not just inside her, but in the air around her. No one in first class avoided her eyes anymore. Some looked with quiet apology, others with awe, but none with dismissal. Back at FAA headquarters in D.C., Celeste Vaughn stood before a wall of glass, the city's skyline a muted gray behind her. In her hands was the incident file. Stamped in red, priority investigation, unlawful removal of minor passenger. Subject, Imani West, Flight 451, Seat 2A. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She simply opened the folder and began drafting the order that would shake an entire industry. By noon, 3 internal FAA directives had been issued. 1. Mandatory 2-step passenger verification before any in-flight seat reassignment. 2. Zero-tolerance policy for removals not backed by clear documentation. 3. Bias response training for all airline personnel interacting with passengers, effective immediately. But that wasn't the shockwave. That came next. Because tucked in the margin of Directive 3 was a new clause, Section 4.3, Imani's Rule. At the airline's operations center, panic had replaced professionalism. The CEO of Atlantic Sky Airways, Thomas Dwyer, a man more known for investor earnings than ethics, stood pale-faced in a glass boardroom. He replayed the clip for the 6th time. "She didn't raise her voice," he muttered. "No," replied his legal advisor. "And that's why this is worse." The PR director leaned forward. "We have to get ahead of this. Apologize, settle, name a scholarship after her, something." But the legal team interrupted. "It's past that. The FAA is involved, there's going to be a federal hearing, and then the final blow. Director Vaughn herself has filed the complaint." The room fell still. Everyone knew what that meant. No spin, no out-of-court settlement. This was about to become a national case study. On board Flight 451, Imani felt the soft turbulence roll beneath them as the aircraft sliced through jet streams. For most, it was just another flight. For her, it was an invisible battle. One she hadn't wanted, but had been forced to fight anyway. Eric Dawson, the junior attendant, made his way quietly toward her row. He didn't speak at first, just stood near her aisle, hand gently resting on the food service cart. Then, with a voice as fragile as glass, he said, "I should have said something. I'm sorry." Imani looked up, and for a second she saw the weight on his shoulders, the guilt of watching, of knowing, of doing nothing until it was almost too late. But she didn't answer with anger. She just nodded and said softly, "You can still say something." Eric blinked. "To who?" She tilted her head. "Everyone." And with that, she turned back toward the window. By the time Flight 451 landed, media vans were already parked at the terminal. Reporters lined the arrivals corridor. The FAA had issued a rare public statement. Today's events on Flight 451 highlight a disturbing lapse in professional conduct and passenger rights. The minor involved had every legal right to remain in her assigned seat. The actions taken were unjustified and are now under full federal review. The FAA stands with passengers, especially those who are often made invisible. This ends now. And for the first time in aviation history, a teenage girl had forced the sky to stop and listen. Imani didn't exit the plane through the jet bridge. Instead, she waited, at Celeste's request, until the cabin cleared. As she stepped into the aisle, seat 2A now behind her, one by one, the passengers still aboard turned. No one clapped. There were no grand speeches, just quiet nods, gazes held longer than before, and a collective sense that something had changed. Outside the gate, Celeste stood waiting in a navy coat, her expression unreadable, until she saw her. Imani stepped into the terminal, shoulders squared, chin high, and walked straight into Celeste's arms. They didn't speak, not right away, because there were no words yet for what had happened, what had been exposed, what was now irreversible. In the days that followed, Sandra Keating's name was added to an internal FAA database as a flagged employee, barring her from airline employment pending further review. Imani's rule was formally added to aviation policy. Civil rights organizations issued public statements of support. High schools and universities began using Flight 451 as a case study in ethics and professional responsibility. And Atlantic Sky Airways quietly reached out to offer Imani a public goodwill partnership, which she respectfully declined, because this wasn't about fame, it was about being seen. And still, Imani never spoke to the media. Not once. No Instagram posts, no TikToks, no viral hashtags from her own account. She returned to school, to her science team, to her backpack full of notes and equations. But in quiet classrooms across the country, her name was whispered with reverence, not for what she said, but for how she sat. "Before we begin today's lesson," the teacher said, pausing in front of a whiteboard, "I want to ask you something." The class of high school juniors at Jefferson Prep shifted in their seats. Phones vibrated, pens tapped, the usual signs of students only half engaged. Then she wrote 3 words on the board: Imani West rule. A murmur spread. One student, a black girl with braids tucked into a neat bun, sat up a little straighter. The teacher turned to face them. "Who here knows what happened on Flight 451? Half the class raised their hands. A few students nodded solemnly. Some still looked confused. And then, softly, from the back of the room, someone said, "That was the girl they tried to move because they didn't believe she had a first-class ticket." The teacher nodded. She didn't yell, she didn't curse, she didn't threaten a lawsuit, she didn't record the flight, she just texted one person, her godmother. "And who was her godmother?" another student asked. The teacher smiled faintly. "The director of aviation safety at the FAA." The classroom fell silent. This wasn't just a story, it was now curriculum. At flight attendant training centers across the country, instructors dimmed the lights. A grainy clip from an in-cabin security feed played. A teenage girl quietly holding her boarding pass. A flight attendant's voice, sharp, dismissive. The silent walk from first class to economy. And then, the return. Not with fury, but with dignity. One trainee whispered, "Why didn't anyone say anything?" An older attendant in the back answered quietly, "Because we've been trained to trust instincts over evidence. And sometimes our instincts are poisoned." The instructor nodded. "And that's why the first thing we now teach is not how to pour a drink or fasten a seatbelt. It's how not to become the reason someone feels like they don't belong." The Imani West clause was now required reading in aviation law seminars at Columbia, Stanford, and Howard University. Its wording was simple. No individual, regardless of age, appearance, attire, or perceived social standing, shall be removed from their assigned seat without documented verification, 2-step cross-check, and full compliance review. Any violation will be treated as a federal breach under FAA disciplinary code. But behind the words was a truth deeper than policy. That human dignity doesn't require uniform, wealth, or pedigree to be respected. It only requires presence. Meanwhile, Imani walked through the halls of her school without a spotlight. She carried her books, ate her lunch quietly, helped classmates with lab reports. But now, teachers paused when they called her name. And students who once brushed past her now met her gaze. There were no parades, no stage, just a slow ripple of recognition. One day, a classmate, Julian, tall, athletic, previously indifferent, approached her at her locker. He held out a printout. "I gotta write a paper for government class." She glanced at the title, Ethics in Public Service, the Flight 451 case. "I don't want to mess it up," he added awkwardly. If I quote you, is that cool?" Imani blinked. "I didn't say anything," he shrugged. "Exactly, and that's why it hit." Then, without waiting for a reply, he added, "I think you made the world quieter, so it could finally hear itself." In a conference room in Atlanta, Celeste Vaughn stood in front of a sea of airline executives. She didn't bring a slideshow. She brought one photo. Projected behind her was the now iconic image from the plane's security feed. Imani, sitting upright in seat 2A. Hands resting gently on her backpack, eyes forward, composed, alone. Celeste said nothing for several seconds. Then, "This is how a revolution begins. Not with shouting, not with outrage, but with stillness." She let the silence stretch. You all run airlines. You know what turbulence feels like. But what she caused wasn't turbulence. It was clarity. And then she closed with 6 words that would later be printed on walls inside major U.S. airports. She didn't move. We had to. Marlene Keating never returned to the skies. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't charged, but her badge was never reissued. Her file remained marked with a red flag. Involuntary seat reassignment violation, minor passenger. She disappeared from aviation forums, but in closed-door HR meetings her name was still spoken, softly, sharply, as a warning. Not of malice, but of blindness. Of the cost of casual exclusion, and the arrogance of believing you can decide someone's worth at a glance. In the corner of a quiet coffee shop near D.C., Imani sat one evening with a notepad full of equations, sipping cocoa. Across from her, Celeste typed notes into her laptop. They didn't speak much. They never needed to. But after several minutes, Celeste looked up and asked, "Do you understand what you did?" Imani looked out the window. Beyond the glass, a plane cut through the sky like a promise. Then she said, "I didn't want to do anything. I just didn't want to disappear." Celeste nodded. "And that made you unforgettable." When Time magazine released its annual list of voices who shifted the culture, Imani's face wasn't on the cover. She wasn't interviewed. She didn't pose. But her name was there. Just one line beneath a mosaic of activists, athletes, and artists. Imani West, 16, passenger, catalyst, proof. No tagline, no fanfare. Because her story wasn't one of spectacle. It was one of silence, of sitting still when the world tried to push her away. And so, she became the girl students debated in ethics class. The reason a new protocol flashed across airline crew tablets before every takeoff. The calm face now embedded in federal compliance slides. Not because she demanded it, but because the sky itself had bent in response to her refusal to yield. "She's just a kid," one senator muttered. "She's a federal icon now," the aide corrected. In a high-ceilinged office inside the Capitol, the Subcommittee on Transportation Ethics had just finished reviewing footage from Flight 451. No music, no narration, just raw audio and visuals of a teenage girl being asked to move, then quietly reclaiming her space with the quiet backing of federal law. A second senator leaned back in his leather chair. She didn't throw a fit, didn't curse, didn't record it on TikTok. "No," the aide said. "She just sent one text." And stopped an entire flight. 3 weeks after the incident, Imani West received an envelope in the mail, hand-delivered, no stamp. The return address, U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Transportation Ethics, Washington, D.C. Inside, an invitation. Private session, closed doors, no press. The subject, Modernizing Passenger Rights, the Human Factor. Celeste found her reading it that night, seated on the worn couch in their modest living room, legs folded under her, a cup of cocoa in hand. "You don't have to go," Celeste said. Imani didn't answer right away. She stared at the letter. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Celeste said softly. "But you answered it." The private room was colder than Imani expected. High ceilings, walls covered in acoustic panels, no cameras, no flashing lights, just a semicircle of elected officials who had already heard the story 1,000 different ways, but never directly from the girl in seat 2A. She wore a plain navy sweater, her hair pulled back into a single braid. No makeup, no fuss, just presence. Senator Margaret Breen, chairwoman of the session, smiled politely but with restraint. "Miss West, we appreciate you making time for us." Imani nodded. "I didn't think it was optional." A few chuckles broke the tension, but Breen leaned forward, her tone changed. "Can I ask you a question?" Imani gave a small nod. "If you could go back, would you do it differently?" There it was, the question everyone wanted to ask, but had been too careful to voice. Imani tilted her head slightly, thinking. The silence stretched, not because she was avoiding, but because she was considering every word. "No," she said at last. "I wouldn't change what I did, but I wouldn't wish it on anyone else." Senator Breen folded her hands. "Why not?" Imani's voice didn't tremble. "Because I had to think about whether telling the truth would get me kicked off a plane. Because I had to choose between speaking up and being seen as a threat." She met the senator's eyes. That shouldn't be a choice a 16-year-old has to make. Later that evening, Breen sat alone in her office, watching the footage again. But this time, she paused it, not on Marlene's confrontation. Not on the FAA agent's boarding. But on the exact moment Imani returned to her seat in silence. That stillness, that poise, it haunted her. Because it wasn't the defiance of a rebel, it was the caution of someone who had learned too early how to protect herself. Back in D.C., Celeste had prepared a quiet dinner, roasted vegetables and jasmine rice, with the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. Imani returned late, placing her backpack gently on the floor. She didn't say much. Just took off her shoes and sank into the armchair by the window. Celeste watched her for a moment, then asked, "What did they want?" "To understand," Imani said. "And?" Imani shrugged faintly. "I don't know if they really did." Celeste walked over and handed her a mug of tea, warm and steady. "Understanding comes in waves," she said, "but you've started the tide." In the following days, Imani's testimony, though private, began to circulate within federal networks. Clips from her prior case were added to FAA sensitivity briefings. The term West threshold was coined in a transportation ethics paper, referring to the invisible line between protocol and prejudice. Even unrelated industries began to take note. Tech companies used Flight 451 as a corporate bias training case study. A medical school in Boston referenced Imani's case in a seminar titled, "First, Do No Harm, Even When It's Invisible." And one airline CEO began his speech at a global summit with just 4 words: "We moved her first." But through it all, Imani stayed the same. She still helped classmates after school, still read physics journals in bed, still walked to the corner bakery on Sundays for her favorite chocolate croissant. She turned down all interview requests. She ignored influencer DMs offering collabs, because the goal had never been attention, it had been integrity. One cloudy afternoon, while visiting a Smithsonian exhibit on Black changemakers in transportation history, Imani found herself standing before a new digital installation. It featured air traffic pioneers, Tuskegee Airmen, and now, her. A touchscreen showed her name. The title, "The Passenger Who Changed the Course." She stared at it for a long moment. Then she reached forward and tapped the More Info icon. Her photo faded into view. She expected a headline, a date, maybe a dramatic quote, but instead, just this. She boarded quietly. She sat calmly. They moved her without reason, and so the sky itself stopped to make room. A girl nearby, no older than 12, nudged her mother and pointed. "That's the girl, right, from the airplane story?" Imani didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because in that moment she saw it. She was no longer just the girl in seat 2A. She was the question that every system now had to ask before making a decision. Are we doing this because of protocol or prejudice? And somewhere far away in a different airport, a young trainee at her first flight attendant orientation raised her hand. What happens if a passenger refuses to move, and I really think they're not supposed to be there? The instructor looked at her with a level gaze. Then you stop, she said, and you ask yourself one thing. Am I seeing this passenger, or just seeing who I think they're supposed to be? The trainee nodded slowly. because now they had a name for that standard. They called it Imani's line. She doesn't want the medal? The question bounced through the hallway like a dropped stone. Not out of anger, out of disbelief. The National Ethics Committee had already drafted the press release. The headline was perfect. Courage at 30,000 feet, Imani West to receive civilian honor for integrity. Senators had signed off. Media outlets prepped tribute segments. A bronze plaque had already been engraved. But when the call reached Celeste Vaughn and she gently relayed the offer to Imani, the teen's answer was unshakable. No thank you. What do you mean, no? Celeste asked gently, not pushing, just needing to understand. Imani sat cross-legged on the rug in their small living room, flipping through a worn book of poems by Maya Angelou. I don't want to be a symbol, she said softly. I just want systems to stop pretending they didn't see us all this time. Celeste nodded slowly. You do know that accepting could amplify the message. Imani looked up, eyes steady. Or make them feel like they've paid enough just by giving me a trophy. Celeste didn't push again, because she understood. Imani didn't want recognition. She wanted reconstruction. The next day, Imani sent a letter, not to the committee, not to the press, but directly to the FAA and Atlantic Skies leadership team. It was handwritten, in calm block letters. No slogans, no demands, just clarity. Thank you for the offer. But I cannot accept a medal for surviving something that should never have happened in the first place. I didn't act bravely. I acted carefully, because I knew how fast people like me are treated as threats for simply asking questions. If you want to honor what happened on that flight, don't give me a platform. Give someone else a fair seat before you even consider moving them. Make that the standard, not the exception. Imani West. The letter leaked within hours. Not because Imani sent it to the press, but because someone inside the committee couldn't believe its grace. News anchors read it out loud. Social media reposted it in stylized quote cards. And yet again, Imani's silence carried more weight than the words shouted by a dozen pundits. At a high school in Minneapolis, a teacher wrote the full letter on the whiteboard and turned to her class. This, she said, is how dignity looks on paper. In a training room at Delta Airlines, the regional manager pointed to a projected copy and told her team, if you're ever unsure of what to do on a flight, ask yourself, would this decision survive her eyes? Meanwhile, in the polished offices of Atlantic Sky, the board of directors held an emergency ethics review. Not because of lawsuits, not because of ratings, because one 16-year-old girl had rejected their gesture, and in doing so, shown them how shallow it really was. The CEO, Thomas Dwyer, looked across the table at his executives. We offered her a medal, he said. She handed us a mirror instead. That week, an anonymous Atlantic Sky employee leaked an internal policy change memo to the press. The headline ran in major papers the next morning. Airline adopts passenger dignity protocol, inspired by Imani West. The memo outlined, mandatory pause procedure before passenger displacement. Crew must consult with 2 independent verification sources before any seat change. Immediate third-party review access for passengers who feel unfairly treated. Optional bystander alert cards distributed during pre-flight briefings, empowering witnesses to safely speak up. And at the top of the document, above the procedural codes, a new rule was printed in bold. The West assurance, no one shall be moved until we've moved past assumption. Still, Imani remained at home, quiet and unchanged. She walked to school with her headphones in, studying orbital mechanics and AI ethics. She ignored press fans, politely declined university panels. She turned down every interview. People called her humble, but that wasn't the word. She was anchored. One evening, Celeste returned from work holding a thick envelope. This one came by certified courier, she said, setting it gently on the kitchen counter. Imani glanced up. Another award? Celeste raised an eyebrow. Worse. Imani smirked. Inside was a formal invitation, signed by 3 senators and the vice president herself. They wanted Imani to testify at the Federal Equity and Transportation Oversight hearing. The subject: bias in the skies. I'm not sure they want me to be honest, Imani murmured. Celeste poured tea and set it beside her. Then that's exactly why they need you there. 3 weeks later, Imani sat under the grand lights of the congressional hearing chamber. The panel was full. Senators, agency directors, aviation CEOs, and federal policymakers. She wore the same navy sweater, the The same braid. Her old backpack sat neatly at her feet. No fanfare. No security detail. Just truth. The chairman leaned into his mic. "Miss West, you may begin." She adjusted the mic gently, took a breath, and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but every syllable struck like a bell in a cathedral. The problem with bias is that it doesn't scream. It whispers. It tells you that someone looks like they don't belong. And when no one challenges that whisper, it becomes law. I didn't ground a flight. Your system did. Because someone thought my hoodie meant I was a threat. Someone thought my skin meant I couldn't be smart enough to sit in first class. And dozens of people thought silence was safer than fairness. You're asking how to fix this. The answer is simple. Don't build systems that depend on girls like me to stop them. Build systems that don't start the harm at all. No one spoke when she finished. One senator had tears in her eyes. Another looked down at the transcript and just wrote 2 words: rebuild everything. As she walked out of the Capitol, Celeste waiting nearby, a reporter called out, "Imani, did you feel like you're changing the world?" She paused, then answered softly, "No, I just stopped letting it change me." The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum was quiet that morning. No school tours, no guide speeches, just the low hum of air conditioning and the echo of polished shoes on marble floors. In a newly opened wing, beyond the historic flight decks and astronaut exhibits, stood a small installation, modest, simple, but quietly profound. Inside a circular display room, framed in glass and brushed aluminum, sat one object, Seat 2A, still upholstered in dark navy fabric, still bearing the faint pressure line of a shoulder rest once adjusted with care. A small plaque stood beside it. Seat 2A, Flight 451. This seat belonged to a 16-year-old girl named Imani West, who was removed from it due to racial profiling during pre-flight boarding. Her silent resistance and principled courage prompted national reform in aviation ethics. This artifact remains a reminder. Some seats are earned. Some are taken, but the right to sit with dignity must never depend on appearance. Imani stood in front of it, not as a celebrity, not even as a guest of honor, just as herself, hoodie zipped halfway, sneakers scuffed, fingers curled around the strap of her old green backpack. Next to her, Celeste stayed back, giving space. The exhibit had been Celeste's idea, but she hadn't forced it. She only told Imani it was there, and left the decision to come entirely in her hands. And now here they were. Imani stared at the chair for a long time. It wasn't grand, it wasn't special, it was just a seat. But somehow it now held the weight of a nation's conscience. A few quiet footsteps approached. A little girl, no older than 9, with curly hair tied in puffs, walked toward the display. Her parents followed at a respectful distance. The girl wore a tiny jean jacket and carried a notebook that read, "Future Astronaut." She stopped beside Imani, gazing up at the seat. "Is this the one from the airplane?" she asked softly. Imani nodded. The girl blinked at it, then back at her. "I read about you in class. You didn't shout or anything. You just sat." Imani smiled gently. "That's all I did." The girl paused, then whispered, "I want to sit where you sat." The sentence hit deeper than applause ever could. Because it wasn't about fame, it was about permission. Permission to belong. Permission to be seen. Permission to sit, not because someone said she was worthy, but because she always had been. Imani crouched gently beside her. "You don't need to sit there," she said. The girl tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because now," Imani said, pointing to the entire room, "every seat's yours." Later, after the girl had gone, Imani sat on a bench across the room, watching visitors stop and read the plaque. One man took a photo with his phone. One woman wiped her eyes. A flight attendant walked up, stood silently for a moment, and quietly saluted. None of them approached her, but they didn't need to, because in that moment she wasn't being looked at. She was being understood. Celeste finally joined her, sitting beside her on the bench. "She reminded me of you," she said. Imani nodded. "She was braver than I was at that age," Celeste chuckled. "No, sweetheart, you were brave long before anyone noticed." They sat there for a while, watching, breathing, remembering. Then Celeste asked, as she had asked before, "Would you do it again?" Imani didn't look away from the seat. She just whispered, "Yes. But this time, I'd take someone's hand when I did it." That night, the museum director emailed Celeste with a small, private note. "Visitors keep leaving post-it notes near seat 2A. We're going to start collecting them in an archive." The messages are too beautiful to discard. One said, "I always thought I had to get louder to be heard, but you showed me that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who rewrites the rules." Meanwhile, across the country, airlines continued reshaping their training programs. At every major hub, Atlanta, LAX, O'Hare, JFK, digital signs in break rooms flashed rotating reminders. Imani's guiding questions. Am I assuming or am I verifying? Would I ask this of anyone else? Am I silencing someone because I'm afraid of the answer? And beneath those questions, 3 simple words: see her clearly. In classrooms, children began writing essays titled, "My Seat at the Table." In debate clubs, Flight 451 became a case study in silence as resistance. In college dorms, students printed out quotes from Imani and taped them to their walls, not for inspiration, but for reminder. Because in a world that so often shouted over young black girls, Imani West sat and made the whole world listen. It began with a letter. No signature, no return address. Just a crisp cream envelope slipped beneath the door of Celeste in Imani's apartment on a rainy Thursday evening. Imani found it when she returned from tutoring a local middle school STEM club. She opened it slowly, expecting another invitation, another op-ed draft, maybe another award she'd quietly decline. But it was none of those. It was handwritten, the penmanship careful, the message unexpected. Imani, I was on Flight 451. I sat in 2C, just across the aisle from you. I watched what happened, watched you stand up, quietly walk away, and carry the weight that should have been shared. I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because I told myself it wasn't my fight. I should have said something then. So I'm saying it now. If you're willing, I'd like to speak to you in person, with respect. An old coward trying to become a better witness, Imani sat with the letter in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper like it might fray under the weight of regret. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she just stared out the window as the rain painted quiet streaks across the glass. And then she said, almost to herself, "It took them this long to find their voice." Celeste, sitting nearby with a cup of chamomile tea, looked up. "They found it because of you." "No," Imani whispered. "They found it because silence echoes. And maybe this time, it echoed loud enough." The next morning, Imani replied. She left a note at the front desk of the museum where the Seat 2A exhibit was housed. "Meet me at the place where everything changed. I'll be there. Saturday, 10 a.m., come as you are." 2 days later, she arrived at the museum early, slipping past the velvet rope as a staff member nodded her through. She stood once again before the seat, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. At 10:02 a.m., a quiet man approached, early 50s, silver at his temples, a charcoal coat, no press, no camera, just remorse. He stopped a respectful distance away, their eyes met, and he whispered, "I remember your backpack, the green one." Imani nodded. "It's still here." She didn't offer more, she waited. He stepped forward, slow and uncertain. "I watched them remove you like luggage, and I sat there, pretending to check my phone." He swallowed. "I thought, she's young, she'll be okay. But you shouldn't have had to be okay." Silence. Then gently she asked, "Why are you here now?" He exhaled slowly. "Because watching that moment again on the news, I realized I had a voice the whole time. I just didn't use it when it mattered most." Imani tilted her head. "Why now?" "Because you never raised your voice," he said, "and still the world shifted. I figured maybe I could shift too." They sat together on the bench opposite Seat 2A. He spoke quietly, about his own daughters, about guilt, about how easy it is for adults to rationalize cowardice by calling it professionalism. She listened, and when he finally paused, voice trembling, he asked, "Do you forgive me?" Imani didn't answer right away, because forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't a transaction. It was a posture. Eventually she looked at him and said, "I don't need to forgive you for me. I already made peace with your silence." She stood, adjusting her backpack. "But maybe you should forgive yourself. So next time you don't stay silent." He nodded, eyes wet but steady. "Then I promise. There won't be a next time." Later that week, Celeste noticed a shift in Imani's routine. She'd begun leaving earlier on Saturdays. One morning, Celeste followed, discreetly at first. She watched Imani enter a small public library in the city's south side, greet a handful of students, and begin leading them in something informal but powerful. A mentoring circle. Not for press, not for college apps, but for presence. She taught them physics tricks with paper clips and rubber bands. Helped one girl write a speech for a city council competition. Sat beside a boy learning to read at 13. All the while she repeated the same 3 questions. Do you know who you are? Do you know what you deserve? Are you willing to sit down until they see it too? Word began to spread, not online, but through whispered gratitude. She's the one who listens. She doesn't talk down to us. She reminds me I don't have to get loud to be powerful. At the museum, a new note appeared beside seat 2A, unsigned. It simply said, she didn't raise her voice, but she raised a generation. The classroom wasn't in a school. It was a training cabin, a mock airplane installed inside the Flight Academy of America, nestled in a converted hangar just outside Atlanta. Rows of imitation business class seats lined the fuselage. Emergency lights glowed gently above. Everything was pristine, controlled, safe. Inside, 24 aspiring flight attendants sat in crisp uniforms, not yet stained by time or turbulence. Most were young. A few were switching careers. All of them had one thing in common. They'd heard of Imani West. They'd watched the video, studied the transcripts, seen the empty seat in the Smithsonian. And now, she stood in front of them, not behind a podium, not under a spotlight, just in front of seat 2A, wheeled in quietly from storage, set in place like an anchor in time. Imani wore no badge, no blazer, just her favorite navy sweater, her green backpack resting beside her again. She looked out at the group and spoke. You've already studied FAA codes, emergency exits, CPR procedures, beverage service, conflict de-escalation. She paused. But today I'm here for something that's not in your training manual. Silence. No one moved. She stepped beside seat 2A and gently ran her hand across the armrest. This is a seat, nothing more, nothing less. Fabric, foam, steel. Then she looked up, but on one flight, it became something else. She didn't rehash the whole story, didn't need to. Instead, she offered them a question. What gives you the right to decide who belongs here? A few students shifted. One man raised a hesitant hand. The ticket, the manifest. Imani nodded. Yes, but what happens when you don't look at it? Silence again. What happens when instinct tells you someone's in the wrong seat? Because their clothes aren't tailored, their hair isn't sleek, their shoes aren't polished? She gestured to herself. I was 16, black, quiet. I had a valid boarding pass. I was told to move. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone was calm, steady, and everyone let it happen. She took a breath. I'm not here to guilt you. I'm here to give you a lens. She walked down the aisle slowly. You're not just stewards of safety. You're stewards of dignity. You control space, attention, tone. She stopped beside a row. Every aisle you walk is a moment of decision. Will you meet a person where they are, or judge them for not matching the picture in your head? She looked around. Because one assumption, whispered to the wrong person, can feel like an eviction from belonging. She returned to the front of the cabin. Flight 451 didn't change because I fought. It changed because someone finally listened. She gestured to the room. You all have power, real power, not just over procedures, but over how people feel the moment they step through that aircraft door. Then softly, use it better than they used it on me. At the end, no one applauded. They stood, some with tears, some with resolve. All of them changed. Because for the first time in their training, they hadn't been taught how to handle a crisis. They'd been taught how to prevent one. A few days later, the academy added a permanent inscription to the training cabin's entrance. Every attendant now passed it before their first simulation flight. Before you walk the aisle, remember her seat. Seat 2A, Flight 451. Imani left quietly that day. No cameras, no microphone. Just a notebook filled with names of students who'd asked to stay in touch. A folded letter handed to her from one trainee that simply read, You showed me that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of strength. Back home, Celeste met her at the door. How was it? Imani dropped her bag and smiled faintly. They listened. Celeste set down her laptop and walked over, cupping her goddaughter's face. They'll remember, because you didn't just take back a seat. You gave them all one too. Final scene, a new flight, different airline. Imani boards, not as a passenger, but as an honored observer for a bias prevention audit program she helped write. She walks down the aisle. Every attendant nods with recognition, not fame, but respect. Seat 2A is empty. They'd reserved it in her name. She doesn't sit. Instead, she turns, looks over the cabin, and gently places her hand on the headrest, not to reclaim it, but to release it, so no one else ever has to. To the world, she was just a teenage girl in a hoodie. To the airline, she was just another passenger. To the flight attendant, she was a problem to be removed. But to justice, she was the reason the entire plane stopped. Imani West didn't shout, she didn't demand, she didn't fight back with rage. She fought back with silence, with stillness, with truth. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her seat, she made the world question who they were willing to see and who they were willing to ignore. She didn't want the spotlight, she didn't want the medal. All she wanted was to sit in peace. So the next time you see someone being pushed aside, ask yourself, will you stay silent, or will you finally take a seat beside them? Because Imani West already showed us what happens when the quietest person on the plane becomes the one who grounds it.